Hi, welcome to Superfluous Studios. I'm Jeff. Today, I'm going to be comparing two different famous, classic, very popular vintage Fender amps to each other. Now, they're from two different generations, but I want to see how similar or different they sound. So I'm going to be talking about this 1964 Fender Champ from the Black Panel era. I'm going to be comparing that to a Tweed Princeton from 1959. So you may say, Jeff, why would you compare these two different amps? Why wouldn't you compare a Princeton to a Princeton or a Champ to a Champ? Because they made those across eras too. And the answer is that despite the fact that they came from two different decades and that they look different, they have almost identical circuits in them and a lot of similarities. But one thing that's not the same about them is that these Fender Tweed Princetons from the 50s go for almost twice as much as these Black Panel Champs do. Now there's a lot of videos out there that demo both of these amps, but I haven't been able to find any that compares these directly to each other, despite the fact that they're so similar. So if you're thinking about getting into one of these amps, but you can't really decide if it's worth the extra money for the Tweed, check this out, because these aren't the kind of amps that you find sitting around together in the same room a lot of the time. You can't go down to your local Guitar Center and try them both out and say that I like this one better than the other one. Also, even if you do manage to find two of them, it's often hard to find two that are both in good condition or haven't had a whole bunch of modifications or had parts replaced or anything like that. So stick around and see how these two sound. Alright, so let's get into it. I'm going to go through a very brief history of these Fender amps from this era, and then talk more about the circuit and these amps themselves. So if you know that stuff, or if you don't care about that stuff, skip ahead to whatever time it says below, and you can go straight to how they sound. So there's a ton of information out there about the history of Fender amps. So I'm not going to go into that in too much depth because that could take days on its own, and it's very interesting to me. Leo Fender was extremely busy through the 50s and the early 60s in designing amps. He changed his amps very frequently, both in terms of the circuit, it continued to evolve through that time, and the cosmetics of it. So when you hear about them, they're usually referred to by era in terms of their cosmetics. So he started out making amps that were wood, and then eventually started covering them in tweed, and that was in the probably mid to late 50s, something like that. They went through a few different changes in terms of cosmetics there, but really the most famous era there, and one of the most valuable and famous eras of Fender amps, is the late 50s Tweed era, and that's where this Princeton comes from. These amps have a distinctive character that's very different from the amps after the Tweed era. So then in the early 60s, he started changing the circuits quite a bit and started to get into the brown and tan Tolex era, and then around 63, switched over to the black panel cosmetics. That's generally considered the other sort of pinnacle of vintage Fender amp eras. And with a few exceptions, the most valuable and sought-after Fender vintage amps come from either that late 50s Tweed era or else the black panel era between 63 and about 67 or 68. After that, they switched over to the silver panel cosmetics, and that lasted till the early 80s. Now, the other thing you'll hear about is pre-CBS, when people refer to vintage Fender stuff, both guitars and amps. And what that refers to is that Leo Fender sold the company to Columbia Broadcasting System, CBS, in 65. And generally, the pre-CBS stuff, while Leo Fender still owned the company, is more sought after and considered more valuable. Now, some things changed a little bit, some things changed a lot after that, especially over time. But in the beginning, between the pre-CBS and post-CBS switchover, the amps aren't that different. So why did I pick these two particular amps to compare to each other? Well, like I mentioned in the beginning, these two are actually very similar to each other. And in fact, the Princeton is a lot more similar to this Champ than it is to the Princetons or Princeton reverbs by the time you got to the Black Panel era. And that's because they changed the whole Princeton amp drastically. So it went from being a very simple circuit during the Tweed era, a single tone and volume control in it, an 8-inch speaker, and a single 6v6 run in Class A operation, to a very complex circuit by the time you were in the Black Panel Princeton reverb era. So that's an amp that has tremolo and reverb. You're now up to 4 preamp tubes, and importantly, it switched over to two 6v6s, so now in push-pull configuration, run in Class AB. So overall, a very, very different sounding amp, very different circuit. The Champ also changed a little bit from the Tweed era, where it was just a single control for volume on there, and again, a very, very simple circuit with an 8-inch speaker, to a slightly more complex circuit with a volume, treble, and bass control on it. But it retained its small cabinet and its 8-inch speaker in there, and its single-ended topology with the single 6v6 run in Class A. So that Tweed Princeton is actually very similar to this Champ. There's a couple key differences, though. First of all, while they both have a 8-inch speaker, and both of these came with Alnico speakers which were very similar to each other, they had slightly different size cabinets, which will change the sound a little bit. The second major difference is in the circuit. The Princeton just has that one single tone control, while the Champ had gone to 2 knobs for the tone control, both a treble and a bass. While that doesn't sound like a huge difference, it does change the sound of the two, because you now have the sound going through 2 pots for the tone circuit rather than one, which loads the signal down more. And in fact, one of the very common mods to do to these Champs is to take out one of those controls and one of those pots and essentially make that tone control identical to the one that's in this Princeton. And you'll see why as I get into the demo here. The third major difference in these is that the transformers changed from the time of the Tweed era into the Black Panel era. Now, Fender used a number of different transformers through both of those eras, but that output transformer in particular is one of the absolutely critical things to the sound of these, particularly in such a simple circuit. This particular Princeton that I have here is from 1959 and has a Triad 107 output transformer in it. Now, I'm not an expert on transformers or these vintage Fender transformers and what they used there, but my understanding is that during that era they used a number of different Triad transformers for the output transformer. This particular one is the most robust of all of those, and I think it's one of the less common ones out there. And by the time you got to the Black Panel era, Fender was primarily using Schumacher transformers, so a different company, slightly different way of designing the output transformer, and that leads to a different sound. Now, as for the two particular amps I have here, the other reason that I chose to do this with these two is that these are really beautiful examples of these two amps. Both of them are almost completely unchanged and the original circuit. The Champ is entirely the original circuit. There's nothing that's been changed in that other than that somebody put a 3-prong cord on there. Otherwise, everything is 100% original in there, including the electrolytic caps, which still seem to be working great. Now, the Princeton is almost equally as original. It's only had the electrolytic caps changed in it. So that's the filter caps and a couple of the other caps in there, which I think were bad. I actually have the original caps. I've never tried putting them back in there to see if they work or not. That's also had a 3-prong cord put in it, but otherwise it's 100% original. Now, for this particular demo, what I'm trying to see is how different does the actual circuit sound. Now, my goal is to eliminate as many of the variables as I can here. So I did a couple of things to do that. One is that I'm going to play these through the same speaker and the same cabinet. I picked the Princeton cabinet. I could have done it with either one. I'm going to play them both through there. I also put a different speaker into that for this. I put in a Warehouse Guitar Speakers G8C. And the reason that I did that is that these vintage speakers from these, while some people like them a lot, I don't actually particularly like them very much. I find that they get a lot of very strange harmonics in there and sometimes some strange resonant frequencies, probably because they're little speakers and they're very old at this point, and they are dried out and can do some strange things. The speakers in both of these sound pretty okay to me, but they do have some strange frequencies in them. So to eliminate any of that stuff and make sure that you're hearing the circuit as much as possible, I'm going to play them through the same speaker and a modern speaker that's a little bit smoother than those old ones. Now, that also allows me to leave the mics in the identical position, so they're mic'd with the same thing, no change in that. So the only change you should be hearing here is the amp circuit itself. In fact, I even used the same tubes in both of them. So I pulled the tubes from the Champ because I think those sound a little bit better and put them in both of them. So these are the same tubes, same speaker cabinet, same mics, same exact recording process. So the only difference is the two circuits here. So let's see how they sound. Okay, so here we go with some examples of how this thing sounds. Right now I'm playing through the Princeton. Keep in mind, like I said before, I'm going to mic both of these amps and play them both through the same cabinet, so it's the exact same setup. I'm going to be playing them both through the Princeton cab with the same speaker, the exact same mics, which are a Royer R121 and a Shure SM57, pretty close to that speaker, both with the same recording chain. No processing on it other than I added just a little bit of room emulation at the end, because these things do sound pretty dry if you just close mic them and do nothing else to them. So I'm using my American Ultra Telecaster here. It only seemed right to play a Telecaster through these things. And at the moment, I've got this thing with the volume on about 10, which on the Princeton, the volume goes up to 12. So this is actually about 3/4 of the way up. And I did that because if you crank it all the way, to me, it gets kind of farty and not the best sound, so I think it sounds best in this range there. That's going to vary a lot with the pickups. Like I said earlier, the hotter the pickups you have going in there, the hotter that sound is going to be, and you're going to have to be very careful with that volume. I've got the tone up around 10 as well, and again, that does kind of interact with the volume to add some gain. So to start out, I just want to show you when we talk about touch sensitivity, what that means. So keep in mind now, I'm going to turn the volume on my guitar all the way up, and just with playing dynamics, see how much we can get a variety of clean to broken up tones out of this thing. So as you can see, it also accentuates any mistakes you make and everything you do. And being a kind of mediocre guitarist, that's a problem for me. So the better guitarist you are, the better these things sound for sure. Okay, here we are with the Champ. Now I've got the volume all the way up at 10 on the amp, and I've got the bass and the treble both set around 7. I'm not going to mess around with those too much. Again, they do have some interaction with the volume in terms of gain, and have some, not a huge effect on the bass and treble. Alright, so let's see what happens if we roll down the guitar volume a little bit. If you roll down the volume a little bit, you still get a lot of those nice harmonics in there, a lot of those high order harmonics that gives it a lot of that sparkle. Now let me try something different here and turn the volume up on the guitar and turn the volume down on the amp. So hopefully this comes through on the recording, but to me it does sound pretty different than when you use the volume on the guitar to control your dynamics and control the distortion. It loses some of that sparkle in the top end to me and some of those high frequency harmonics, and it also sounds a little bit thinner to me, or maybe a lot thinner. Now that might actually work better if you want a clean tone in a mix in a song that you're recording, because it might take out some of that low end and just fit better. But it definitely in the room sounds thinner to me, more mid-rangey, just different. Here's with the volume down a little bit on the guitar. So all in all, it has less gain than the Princeton, and again, that's largely because of that tone circuit that takes some of that out of there. And that's why people do that mod, to make it a little bit more like the Princeton in terms of dynamic range, so you have that wider range from the sparkly to the gain. But I actually think that the Champ sounds a little bit more sparkly, a little bit more like the clean sound that you would get in other black panel amps, like the Princeton reverbs. I'm not exactly sure why that is. I think it probably is the difference in the transformers, in particular that output transformer, since that's more like the output transformers that were in the black panel amps. Alright, so let me try turning down the volume on the amp and see how that does on this Champ. So now I've got the volume on the Champ down to about 5 or 6. Below that it really starts to get very thin and the volume starts to drop quite a bit on it. So this is kind of the base level of where you can get it to sound decent. Okay, so there you go. Both amps did some clean sounds, some distorted sounds, a little bit of stuff in between. And again, to go back to the purpose of this video, you have two amps here. One is pretty much twice the value of the other one. You're talking about amps that usually go for around $1,000 in the Black Panel Champ versus an amp that usually goes for $2,000 or so, maybe even more than that with the Tweed Princeton. So to me, where they sound the most similar is in the clean tones. They both can get amazing clean tones by manipulating that signal in a lot of different ways. My favorite way of doing it is keeping the volume on the amp high and controlling the volume on your guitar to get it into that sweet spot. I think it retains a lot of the sparkle that you get out of it and a lot of that really beautiful range of harmonics that you're getting out of it, while taking away a lot of that distortion as well. I think you lose a little bit of that if you just turn down the volume on the amp. So the other major difference that I hear is the range of distortion that you can get. The Champ kind of maxes out at a certain point where the Princeton keeps going and gets you more distortion, more of that classic rock and roll sound to it. You also, of course, get the cosmetic differences, and Tweed is cool, and that's probably part of why they're worth more. But that sound difference is not insignificant. Now, you can actually get the Champ to sound more like the Princeton, and that wasn't necessarily the purpose of this video, but like I talked about before, it's so sensitive to input that you can actually drive that input more by just putting a boost pedal in front of it, like a clean boost pedal, like an EP boost or something like that, or going with hotter pickups on there to do that. You could also mod the Champ, like I talked about earlier, to make that tone circuit the same as the tone circuit in the Princeton, and then you're going to probably get more gain, and a lot of people do that. And that'll get you a lot closer to that distortion sound that's in the Princeton and that bigger range of sound there. So what do you think? Is the Princeton worth twice as much as the Champ? Do you like these at all? It seems a little crazy to me sometimes that these are worth this much money in the first place, but that's what they're going for. Let me know what you think.